room was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Rows of men sat in silence, dressed in sharp military uniforms and dark suits, their polished boots glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. The Ba'ath Party insignia hung behind them, a proud symbol of revolution now looming like a silent threat. The air felt heavy, as if it carried the weight of every unspoken fear in that room. Then the door slammed open. Two guards dragged in a trembling man, his collar drenched in sweat. He didn't resist. He didn't even speak. Seconds later, the muffled crack of gunfire echoed through the walls. The sound froze everyone in place. The cameras were still rolling. The microphones were still on. What was meant to be a political meeting had just become an execution chamber. This was July 22nd, 1979. The day Saddam Hussein turned a political gathering into a nightmare. Just a few days earlier, Saddam had officially taken power, replacing his cousin Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr as president of Iraq. To the public, it seemed like an orderly transfer, a natural step after years of Saddam serving as the real power behind the scenes. But to those who knew the inner workings of the Ba'ath Party, this was no peaceful handover. Saddam had maneuvered, manipulated, and coerced his way into total control. He wanted to send a message. The revolution didn't belong to a committee or an ideology anymore. It belonged to him. That morning, more than 400 top officials were ordered to attend a special meeting at the presidential palace in Baghdad. It was supposed to be a celebration, a rally of unity under Iraq's new leader. The hall was decorated with red banners, the scent of polished wood and tobacco mixing in the air. Television cameras lined the back wall to record what was meant to be a display of patriotic loyalty. But beneath the ceremonial pomp, there was a thick undercurrent of unease. Saddam entered the hall dressed in a dark military uniform, every medal precisely pinned, every motion deliberate. He smiled faintly, greeting officials with handshakes that felt more like warnings. He was only 42, but his eyes were those of a man who had already seen and ordered far too much death. As he took his seat at the head of the table, silence fell across the hall. The first speeches began, standard lines about loyalty, revolution, and the future of Iraq. But halfway through, Saddam raised his hand. The room fell silent. He stood, his voice calm but charged with danger. "Comrades," he said slowly, "I have uncovered a conspiracy, a plot against our revolution, against our party, and against me." A murmur rippled across the room. Men exchanged nervous glances. No one dared to speak. Then Saddam motioned to the guards, who brought forward a gaunt, terrified man, a senior Ba'ath Party member named Muhi Abdul Hussein. He carried a crumpled sheet of paper and looked as though he hadn't slept in days. Saddam gestured toward the microphone. "Tell them," Saddam said. Abdul Hussein's voice trembled as he began to read. "The following individuals," he said, "have betrayed the revolution." The first name echoed through the room like a death sentence. All eyes turned toward the man identified. Guards immediately moved in, seized him, and dragged him out. The doors slammed shut behind them. Moments later, gunfire. The next name was read. Another arrest. Another gunshot. Within minutes, the hall was transformed into a living nightmare. Officials who had known each other for years, who had celebrated together, dined together, fought alongside one another, now sat in horror, knowing that at any second, their name could be next. Some wept quietly. Others stared straight ahead, trying not to move. A few pleaded their loyalty aloud, but it didn't matter. This wasn't justice, it was theater, and Saddam was the director. As the reading continued, Abdul Hussein's voice began to falter. His hands shook violently. "Please, no more," he whispered. Saddam's cold eyes fixed on him. "Continue," he said. The guards handed the man water, and he resumed reading. Voice cracking, the sound of gunfire punctuating each new name. The walls seemed to vibrate with every execution. Hours passed. The hall grew hotter, the smell of sweat thick and sour. Some men fainted. Others clutched at their hearts. But Saddam sat motionless, occasionally leaning back in his chair, exhaling cigar smoke through a faint smile. He was demonstrating something far more sinister than leadership. He was showing the anatomy of absolute power. When the final name was read, Saddam Hussein collapsed to the floor, sobbing. Saddam slowly stood and began clapping. The sound of his applause echoed in the hollow silence. "This," he said, "is how we protect the revolution." But it wasn't over. Saddam turned to the survivors, those who had not been named, and said, "Those who remain must prove their loyalty." The words sent a new wave of terror through the hall. At first, no one understood. Then he clarified. They would personally carry out the executions of their comrades. The room filled with quiet gasps. Some men looked as if they'd been struck. Saddam's gaze swept over them like a blade. "The revolution must cleanse itself," he said coldly. "Do your duty." One officer hesitated. Saddam stepped forward, his boots clicking against the marble floor. "Do it," he said softly. "Show your loyalty to Iraq." The man nodded, trembling, and was handed a rifle. Moments later, the sound of another gunshot echoed through the compound. The executions continued until nightfall, carried out by the very men who had survived the list. By the end of the day, 66 Ba'ath officials were dead. Dozens more were imprisoned. And those who remained had become tools of Saddam's regime, not by choice but by fear. He had turned them into executioners, making them complicit in his violence. The next day, Iraq's state television aired edited footage of the meeting. The broadcast painted Saddam as a hero who had saved the revolution from betrayal. The people watching from their living rooms saw him as a decisive, fearless leader. They didn't see the trembling men, the blood or the tears, only strength, only control. In reality, Iraq had changed overnight. Every politician, general, and minister now understood the rules. Loyalty was no longer about ideology. It was survival. A single whisper, a wrong expression, even a delay in applause could mean death. Saddam had replaced politics with fear, trust with paranoia. Over the following years, that fear would expand into every corner of Iraqi life. Children were taught to revere him. Artists painted his face across murals. Streets, schools, and hospitals bore his name. He was everywhere, on the walls, on the airwaves, in the nightmares of his people. But for those who survived that day in July 1979, the memory never faded. One survivor later said, "We were not living men after that meeting. We were ghosts wearing uniforms." Another recalled that as they clapped for Saddam's closing speech, their hands shook uncontrollably, not from loyalty, but from horror. That meeting marked the birth of Saddam's dictatorship, a regime built on control through terror. Over the next 2 decades, his rule would plunge Iraq into wars, sanctions, and repression. Hundreds of thousands would die, and millions more would live under the shadow of his paranoia. But history has a cruel sense of irony. Decades later, when Saddam was finally captured, disheveled, dirty, hiding in a hole near Tikrit, it was the perfect mirror of the fear he once inspired. The man who made others disappear had vanished himself, reduced to a frightened fugitive begging for mercy. The July 1979 purge wasn't just an event, it was a message, one that echoed across the years. It showed how fear could be weaponized to build empires, and how those empires, in the end, collapse under their own brutality. Because power won through terror is never real power, it's borrowed time. And on that day in Baghdad, Saddam Hussein borrowed from the lives of hundreds, only to find decades later that even dictators must face the silence of their own making. The revolution he claimed to protect ended long before he did. What remained was the echo of gunfire in a crowded hall, and the memory of men who applauded their own destruction. If this story made you think, if it made you feel the chilling reality of power, fear, and control, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more stories that dive deep into the darkest corners of history. Share this video to remind others that every dictatorship starts with silence. And silence is the first step toward tyranny, because history doesn't just repeat, it warns.